Richard with RichMade Knives, and I am making a video for a customer who wants to know how to adjust the lock bar on their knife. So they have a knife where the lock bar is a little weaker, and when the strength of the lock bar engaging on the lock face isn't as strong as it should be, you can end up with a blade play, lock rock. When it's in the closed position, you can end up with a little bit of up and down motion in the blade, and the detent is not as strong. So we are going to recreate the issue on this knife. This is one of my slowpoke models that is going to Blade Show 2019. And this one is all buttoned up and ready to go. So we have a nice strong detent, and we have completely solid lock engagement on this knife. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to de-spring the lock, and then I'm going to show you guys how to fix that. Okay, so when I design the majority of the knives that I make, what I do is I make the pocket clip function as an over travel stop. So when the knife is in the lock position like this, in order to close the knife, you push the lock bar over. You push the lock bar over and close the blade. Well, you can de-spring the lock bar if you push the lock bar over this way too far. So what I've done is, on most of my knives, when I design them, I design it to where the pocket clip functions as an over travel. So right here where the grip part, the front grip part of the pocket clip resides, it straddles the lock bar. I can get you a shot there. It straddles the lock bar so that it helps with, when you go to push the lock bar over, you're hitting up against that pocket clip right there, that front part of the pocket clip right there, which prevents or helps prevent over travel of de-springing the lock bar in the wrong direction. Okay, so that's one of the design elements that I build into my knives to help with that. So what we're going to do is, we've got this knife all perfect now, and when the tension on the lock bar is set just right, you can't, the blade won't fall out. Sometimes people prefer stronger detents, and sometimes people prefer lighter detents. I tend to prefer more, I tend to build knives where the detent is a little stronger, but that's not always the case. Sometimes if it's a really large blade or really heavy blade, it's gonna be able to fall open. So, I'm not saying that knives that necessarily you can shake them and get the blade to come out, I'm not saying they're designed incorrectly. It's just not something I try to avoid if I can, given the design and the weight of the blade. But in any case, let's go ahead and you're going to watch me do something that you shouldn't do, which is we're going to purposely de-spring or over travel this lock bar. Okay, so we've got the blade, the knife in the open position. So what I'm going to, and it's nice and tight. So what I'm going to do is I am going to push the lock bar over too far, and I'm going to de-spring the lock bar. Okay, so here we go. You're going to watch me. I'm going to get a better angle here. So I'm at the point now where I'm at about equal with the body, which is really as far as you ever want to go. This might be a little tough because I've got this pocket clip trying to stop me from going too far, but I'm going to push as hard as I can to de-spring this in this direction. Here we go. Okay, you see I've got this to the point where it's well past the body. Okay, so now I have no lock engagement. Okay, you'll notice the lock is completely straight and I have no detent. Blade is just falling free. Okay, so in this situation, well, what do? How do we fix this? How do we readjust this lock bar? Because we haven't damaged the knife in any way. This can be easily fixed. Titanium is a spring steel that has a characteristic where it remembers its its positioning, and you can bring it and it will revert back to that position. So all we've got to do is retension the lock bar. And that's the purpose for this video, is for me to show customers how to retension the lock bar. And if you have a knife where you want the detent to be stronger, you can give it a little bit more lock bar strength, a little bit more pressure against the detent ball against the hole in the blade. Now, you don't want to go too crazy with adding lock bar, because you will cause lock stick, and you won't be able to get the knife closed, because there's be so much pressure against the face of the blade that it'll be hard to disengage. But in any case, so what do we do now? We've got a knife here that has no lock bar. So what do we do? Well, we're going to take it apart. And all you really have to do to fix this is just to take the presentation side off. You don't have to completely disassemble the knife. So most of my knives use Torx screws. Generally, these are either T8s or T10s, but that can vary. So I recommend picking up a set of Torx bits. These are made by Weha, which is one of the better brands out there, but just about any brand will do. Home Depot sells them. So this is a T8 Weha Torx bit. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the presentation side off by taking these 3 screws out. These are the body screws, so we're going to take the body screws out first. Now, I always Loctite all of my screws. So when you take the screws out, you might find that they're a little bit hard to turn at first because of the Loctite. Now on the pivot, this is the pivot right here. This will be Loctited as well, so this will be challenging to take apart. And you may find when you go to turn this screw that the entire pivot spins. So it's spinning on here and it's spinning on here. There's 2 things you can do to break the Loctite. You can put your T8 Torx bit on this side, and then on this particular pivot there's another T8 Torx bit on this side. So you could use 2 Torx bits, one on each side, to oppose pressure to get to break it. But I realize, if you don't have a Torx set, or you went and bought one, you may not have 2 of the exact same size Torx bits. So there's a little bit of a trick that you can use. What I want you to do to break the Loctite here, if it won't turn, if the whole thing spins when you turn this, is I want you to open the knife to the fully open position like this, and then all you have to do is put your thumb against the blade and push. Okay, so what you're doing is you're pushing the blade this direction. Hold your hand like this to where you can still see the pivot. Put your thumb against the blade. Be careful not to get near the sharp edge. And I just want you to push the blade towards the presentation side. Okay, just put gentle pressure this way. And then take the screw out. Why will this work? Well, what you're doing is you're using the blade as a fulcrum against the pivot to stop it from turning. Okay, so that's a little bit of a trick you can use to undo this pivot. This particular knife does not have Loctite, so we won't have that issue. Okay, so make sure you don't lose any of the hardware. Do this on a place where you have a mat that you can put your hardware on, so that it doesn't roll around. If you're using this on a slick surface, you don't want any of your screws to get lost. Okay, now in order to take the lock side off, you may find that the lock side doesn't want to come off very easily, because the pivot is pressed in with friction. So sometimes when you go to take this presentation side off, it won't come off. So what you want to do is you want to open the blade to this position. Okay. Now I would recommend that you wrap the blade when you're going to do this in with a paper towel, because you do not want to cut yourself on this sharp blade. Or you can use a glove on your left hand, which I'm going to do here. This is not going to be an issue on this particular knife because the pivot is not pressed in, but I'm going to do it for your benefit. So all you really got to do is just get yourself a glove, and that'll really prevent you from cutting yourself, okay? So you're going to hold the blade, and then now what we've got to do is we've got to take this presentation side off. So you might say, well, can't I just lift it off? Well, in this case, I can, but in your case, on your knife, you may not be able to do that because the pivot, the stop pin is pressed into both sides. Not with a ton of pressure, but with enough that pressure that you may not be able to just lift the side off. Okay, so what you want to do is you just want to put your hand on the blade like this, and then you want to grip the presentation side, and then you just want to gently rock it back and forth like this. Okay, just gently rock it back and forth, and as you gently rock it back and forth, you want to pull pressure out this way. That should release the stop pin, which is right here. There's the stop pin. That should allow you to take the presentation side off. Okay. Now with the presentation side off, you're gonna have right here a caged bearing sitting on the pivot between the sitting on the blade that goes between the blade and the presentation side. So all you want to do is just turn it over and let that fall, let that pivot fall out. Let the bearing fall out. Now you can lift your blade off. Okay, and now what we have is we have the rest of the pivot here. We have the other side of the cage bearing, and we have the stop pin right there. Okay, so you can take these parts out. I would recommend taking at least the pivot out and the bearing because you don't want them to fall out and lose them. So I'm going to go ahead and take the pivot out. Okay, so that's what that looks like right there. And then we've got the other bearing sitting in the pocket, so we're just going to turn that over and that will fall out. And then you have your stop pin in here, right there. And you can leave that in there or you can take it out. If it's easy to remove, you can take it out. That's the stop pin. Okay, I'm going to take the glove off so you don't have to look at it anymore. Okay, so now we've got our lock side, and you can leave the backspacer attached. We've got our lock side with our detent ball in there. Okay, and if you look at it straight on, you will see that it's now straight. It doesn't have the tension. So what we want to do is we want to push this lock bar this direction towards the presentation side. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my thumb right here and I'm going to push the lock bar over. Okay, now what you're going to notice is that it's springing back to where it was originally, because that's the magic of titanium, is that it is a spring steel that remembers its previous position. So as I push this, it's returning back to its original position. So what you have to do is you have to push it further than it's going to come back to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the lock bar over, okay? And you're going to do this gently, and then you're going to release it, and you're going to check and see where it stops, okay? And so what you're going to notice now is that it has stopped right about to where it is about even. The outside edge of the lock bar is about even with the inside of the titanium body. That's generally about where you want it to be, okay? That's generally about where you want it to be. If you go further than that and you get the lock bar to where it's way far over, you're going to have a knife that's very difficult to unlock, and that's not what you want. So that's about the position that you want. Now you can test this by, you can test to make sure that it's going to return to that position by pushing the lock bar over, and it should return every time. Push it back to where it is square with the body and release it, and it should return to that same position where the inside edge is just past the body. If it doesn't return to that exact position, then you want to add a little bit more. So you push on it just ever so slightly to where it's back where you wanted it to be, and then test that again, okay? Every time you push it over, it should return to that position. Okay, so I'm going to try to get you a close-up here so you can see what I'm talking about. You want it to be about where the inside edge of the lock bar is about equal with the inside of the frame. Okay, that's about where you want it. Now what you can do is you can do a dry assembly on your knife, and you can test that you're happy with how much lock bar pressure you have put in your lock bar. And if you want more, you can disassemble it and you can move the lock bar over a little bit more and just do it in very, very small amounts because you don't want too much pressure. You want just the right amount where you're happy with the strength of your detent in the closed position and you're happy with how much pressure it takes to unlock the blade. Okay, so now I'm going to reassemble the knife. So we're going to take the pivot. We're going to put the pivot through. We're going to take the stop pin, little stop pin, and we're going to put it in the stop pin hole. And you'll notice I've got my finger on the bottom so the pivot doesn't fall backwards. We are going to take the cage bearing and we're going to put it over the stop pin. We're going to take the blade, we're going to put it over the pivot. Now you're going to have to put downward pressure because it is sitting on the lock bar, you're going to have to put downward pressure on the blade, okay, to get it to where you have the pivot up above the blade. So what I'm in essence doing is putting the lock bar in a flat position. Take your second bearing, put it on the top of the blade. Now one of the things you'll notice is that the bearing has two different sides to it. One side is a rounded side and the other side is open. It doesn't really matter which way. There's no necessarily right or wrong. I personally like to put the side with the round, the closed side down towards the blade so that the open side is facing up. But it's not a rule. It'll work either way. By the way, remember what I said about not cutting yourself? This is where you want to use your glove or have your blade wrapped with a towel, or maybe even put some tape around the blade so that you don't cut yourself. I'm done this 1,000 times, so I'm not too concerned with cutting myself, but I certainly don't want any of you to cut yourself. So this is where you probably want to have a glove on your hand, okay? Now you take your presentation side and you put it on top of the blade and you make sure that your pivot hole is lined up with your pivot, okay? And then you make sure that your back screws are all lined up. And so what I'm doing is I'm squeezing right now, I'm squeezing the body together so that the lock bar, because the lock bar is pushing against me to try to make the whole thing come apart. Okay, so now what you want to do is take your pivot screw and put it into position. Take your Torx bit, and I'm going to load this onto my part here so that I can do this. Well, I've got it on the end there like that. Screw that in there. And you don't want this to be crazy tight. When it comes to a stop, you just give it just a light little extra, a little bit of extra turn, and that's all you want. Now, before you test anything, put one screw into one of these back screws back here, okay? You don't need to put all of the screws in. If you have two, you only have to put one in. If you have three, depending on your model, like this one, you only have to put one screw in the back, okay? Now the knife is assembled with one screw in the back and the pivot screw. And now you want to test your functionality and see if you're happy with how much pressure you now have on the lock bar. Check for lock rock, make sure that you've got enough pressure. Okay, so now we're going to give it a test. And in order to test it, we're going to test for lock rock. We're going to grab the body. We're going to put our fingers up at the top where it's not. And you don't want to push as hard as you can closed or you'll cut yourself. All you're doing is you're just kind of wiggling the blade up and down like this. And you want to make sure that you don't feel any rocking going on back here where the lock is engaged with the body. So I don't feel any rock, okay? Now you want to test, can I open this with relatively ease? Because if you put way too much pressure when you go to open this, it's going to be really hard to push. So you want a medium amount of pressure, and then go ahead and test the close. And in the close position, you can test it to see how hard it is to open by just grabbing the blade and kind of pulling it. You should be able to, it should come out with a firm tug. And you can give it this test if you want. Now remember, some knives will come open if you shake them hard enough. Okay, I'm not saying that is necessarily wrong or right or wrong. It's just personal preference, but that's what you're adjusting. Oh, another thing you want to do is check for blade centering too. If you put way too much pressure, think about it. This lock right now is pushing this blade this direction. So if you put a ton of pressure on the lock bar, you can ever so slightly start to push that blade. The tip of the blade will start pushing that way, because if I put my finger on here and I push, I can decenter that blade. So generally it shouldn't matter how much, that shouldn't move too much, but just something to keep in mind. Okay? And if you're happy with how much pressure you've created in your lock bar, if you don't have any blade play, you don't want to get crazy with it. Don't get in here and start going nuts, because you can actually deform the titanium pockets, and you can deform, you can actually break that those ringed bearings as well. So you're just giving it a gentle, back and forth little tug, just to make sure that you don't have lock slip in here. So give it a little bit of gentle pressure. Check to make sure you're happy with how much pressure, because the detent ball is pushing now against the blade, a hole in the blade, and that you're happy with the action. Okay? And if you're happy with that, then put the rest of your screws in. I do recommend that you put blue Loctite on your screws. Now, that is a personal preference. I always recommend putting it on the pivot. As far as the body screws go, it doesn't hurt to put them in, because believe it or not, you might think it's not necessary, but I have had cases where customers didn't put Loctite on there thinking it was no big deal, and all of a sudden one day they look at their knife and they're missing a screw. Okay, so it doesn't hurt to put Loctite on there. So once you're satisfied with the pressure on your lock bar, just put the rest of your screws back in, and you're good to go. And then the same thing goes for when you're tightening up the body screws. Don't torque them down. When they screw them in until the screw stops, then just give it an ever so gentle little bit of extra turn, and that's it. That's exactly what you want. Okay? So I hope this video was helpful. If you end up in a situation where you want to either adjust your lock bar, or you have a knife where you accidentally over-traveled the lock to where it is no longer locking against the blade, and or you have a blade that just is kind of falling open. You want some pressure there. You certainly don't want to turn this over and have the blade come swinging out on you. That's absolutely not the right way that the knife should be working. So that is for those of you who want to try it yourself. For customers of mine, if you don't want to do this, you can contact me through Facebook or email. Go to my website at richmadeknives.com, send me a message through there, and I will be happy to service your knife for you, fix any issues it has, no matter what they are, and send it back to you. And that tune-up service will be done at no charge if you'd prefer not to do the work yourself. But if you want to do the work yourself, that is the process by which you do it. Just be smart about how much you are bending the lock bar. You don't want to get in there and you're way out here with the lock bar. You could snap it right off if you got too crazy with it. You saw when I was adjusting the lock bar pressure, you don't have to push it very much. And what you want to do is push the lock bar over, release it, and see where it stops. And then go back the other direction 4 or 5 times and make sure it returns back to the position you want it to be in before you finish up and call it good, and that you're happy with that spot. Because the tendency of the titanium will be to return to its home position, and that's what you're trying to establish, is what do you want that home position to be. Thanks, guys. Hope the video was helpful. Richard from RichMade Knives.